It started with the howling, a sound so eerie that even the hardiest locals stopped dead in their tracks to listen. The valley held the noise, letting it echo through the fog-draped mountains like some ancient, unforgotten curse. We were used to the cries of wolves. Our town was carved out of forest, after all, where creatures roamed as they pleased. But this was different. I first heard it late one night, as I was closing up at my bar, the Lucky Star, a place that had been in the family for generations. I wasn't the kind to be easily rattled, but something about the howl made me feel strange, like I was unwelcome in my own town. I looked out the window into the dark, dense woods across the street, feeling the unease seep through me. The howl rose again, this time lower, more guttural, something I could feel in my bones. It's probably just a coyote, I whispered to myself, hoping it was true. Still, that night, I double-checked the locks on my door, something I hadn't done in years. Then, I found out I wasn't the only one who'd heard it. The next morning, the whole town was talking about the noise. Some of the older folks brushed it off, but I could see that even they weren't convinced. Sheriff Nolan tried to reassure everyone, saying it was probably just a stray wolf from the north, but he didn't sound convinced. Deep down, I knew that something bad was coming. I just didn't know how bad. The howling continued for nights on end, always just after midnight. I'd wake up with my heart pounding, like the sound was calling to me specifically, drawing me out of my warm bed and into the cold, damp night. I fought it as best as I could, but one night, curiosity got the best of me. I wrapped myself in my thickest coat, grabbed the flashlight, and slipped outside, the town asleep and silent around me. The sound was louder, sharper, like it was close. Right behind me almost, I felt like I was being watched, and my skin prickled with an animal kind of dread. Just as I neared the tree line, I froze. There, in the soft earth, were enormous tracks. I'd grown up around these woods. I knew wolf tracks, deer tracks, bear tracks. Every footprint left by the creatures that wandered here. They were too big. A chill ran down my spine. I forced myself to breathe, to hold the flashlight steady as I studied the marks. They looked like they belonged to some massive creature that walked on two legs, but with claws so sharp they'd sunk inches into the dirt. I turned to leave, ready to run back to my bed and pretend I hadn't seen anything. But then I heard it again, the low, guttural growl. It was close, too close. I looked up, my flashlight flickering on the edge of the forest. Thick fur covered its body, dark and matted, while its face was twisted into something that looked like it was made of pure malice, teeth bared in a snarl. Its eyes met mine, glowing, furious, and disturbingly intelligent. I realized with a sickening lurch that it was looking right at me, sizing me up like prey. The creature crouched, muscles tensing, and I could see its massive shoulders rise and fall as it prepared to leap. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet wouldn't obey. I was rooted to the spot, watching helplessly as it drew back, ready to pounce. I could feel the earth vibrate with its raw, predatory power, and I knew that if it came for me, I wouldn't stand a chance. Then, as if some divine hand intervened, the clouds rolled in, thick and heavy, covering the moon entirely. I barely registered it at first, too transfixed by the creature before me. But then I saw it happen. The creature staggered, as if something inside it had broken. Its eyes flickered, and its snarl softened into something like confusion. The thick fur began to thin, its hulking frame shrinking, bones cracking and reforming with sickening pops. Its claws retracted, and its snarling, inhuman face contorted, shifting painfully into something closer to a human's. The creature fell to its knees, clawed hands clutching at the ground as the transformation overtook it. I could see its features now, clearer and clearer as the monstrous form faded. For a moment, I just stood there, paralyzed by what I was witnessing. I could feel my heart pounding, telling me to run, to get out of there before it changed its mind. I didn't wait for it to finish. Turning, I ran as hard as I could, tearing through the underbrush, stumbling over roots and rocks, branches scratching at my skin as I forced myself forward. I didn't dare look back. The only thing I could think of was getting as far away from that thing as possible before the clouds shifted, before the moon reappeared, and before it turned back into something that wouldn't let me escape. The whole way back to town, I could hear that growl in my mind, feel those yellow eyes boring into me, even as I threw myself over the threshold of my front door and bolted every lock I could find. The next morning, my legs ached, my throat was raw from panting, and my mind was a mess of tangled, restless thoughts. I could still feel that thing's gaze on me, heavy and lingering, even though it was nowhere in sight. That's when I decided I needed help. Sheriff Nolan had been in town his whole life and knew more about these woods than anyone. Maybe he'd believe me. I found him at the station, looking over some maps with a furrowed brow. He glanced up as I walked in, and I could see his jaw tighten just slightly when he recognized me. He knew why I was there. I took a breath, gathering my nerve. Sheriff, something's out there. It's not a wolf and it's not a bear. There's something else. He didn't answer right away, just looked at me with that same guarded expression. I know what you're going to say, he said finally, his voice low. And before you start, I'll tell you this. It's not the first time someone's come to me with a story like yours. He motioned for me to sit, his eyes never leaving mine. This town's got old secrets, things that go back before my time, before my father's time. He leaned back, crossing his arms. Every few years there's a surge, you could say. People go missing, strange tracks appear. They say these creatures come out when the moon's full, but only if there's no cloud cover. Shuddered, remembering how the moonlight had touched that thing's twisted form, how it had begun to change back only when the clouds swallowed the moon. So what are we supposed to do? The sheriff's face was grim as he nodded slowly. There's only one way to stop it as far as anyone knows. Silver. A direct hit with silver can weaken it enough to keep it down. Maybe for good. But it's not as simple as it sounds. He sighed, rubbing his temple like he was trying to make sense of something that didn't want to fit together. We'd need to find it first, and even then, the timing has to be right. I could feel the frustration in his voice, the weight of something he'd probably spent years trying to ignore. So, we're just supposed to sit back and hope it doesn't show up again? I asked, feeling a surge of helpless anger. He didn't answer, just stared off into the distance, lost in thought. I could see the struggle in his eyes, the same frustration and helplessness churning beneath the surface. He wanted to stop it as much as I did, but there was no clear path forward. We'd need silver, we'd need a plan, and most of all, we'd need to be prepared if it showed up again. Over the next few days, the sheriff and I did our best to prepare, though we both knew how little we had to work with. He managed to track down an old set of silver bullets from his father's things, relics of a time when the people of this town had taken their old legends seriously. The bullets looked crude, hand-cast and tarnished, but they felt heavy and real in my palm, like they might actually make a difference. Only got a handful of these, the sheriff muttered as he handed them to me, his expression tight. You can't waste a single shot, understand? I nodded, feeling the weight of the task settle over me. These bullets weren't just a precaution. They were our only real defense. Still, the question loomed. How were we going to lure out the creature? It wasn't like we could just stroll into the woods and hope it found us before someone else. And if we tried to track it ourselves, we'd risk coming face to face with it on its terms. Alone in the dark, far from help. But every day we waited was another day it might find someone else first. As I left the sheriff's office that night, the silver bullets stowed carefully in my pocket, I could feel the weight of the coming full moon pressing down on me. The clouds had finally cleared, and the moon was nearly full, its pale glow barely veiled by the thin mist settling over the town. I thought about the creature's twisted face, the intelligence in its eyes as it had looked back at me. Whatever it was, this wasn't just some mindless beast. I felt eyes on me as I walked home that night, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. I kept my hand in my pocket, fingers curled around one of the silver bullets as I scanned the darkness around me. But the streets were empty, just the soft rustle of leaves and the quiet creak of an old sign swinging in the wind. By the time I reached my door, I was practically running, my heart thudding as I fumbled with my keys, slipping inside and locking every bolt. The following night, the full moon rose over the town like an omen, casting an eerie glow that filtered through my curtains, bathing my room in cold, silver light. Sleep was impossible. Every creak, every whisper of wind against the window sounded like a footstep, a low growl waiting just beyond the thin walls. Just past midnight, I heard something outside, faint, barely audible, but unmistakably there. A quiet, rhythmic scraping, like claws on wood. My heart clenched as I grabbed my flashlight, inching toward the window. Slowly, I pulled the curtain aside, my breath catching as I peered into the dark. A figure stood just beyond the street lamp's glow, half concealed in shadow. Tall, gaunt, its posture hunched, as if it was holding back some immense, terrible power. Its face was hidden, but I could feel its gaze, heavy and piercing, fixed on me. Even from that distance, I could see its hand flexing, the unmistakable glint of claws against its fingers. I gripped the silver bullets, feeling their cold weight in my hand, but the thought of facing that thing alone, without the sheriff, was enough to make me freeze. I'd seen what it could do up close, and I knew a single mistake would be my end. The creature seemed to sense my hesitation. It tilted its head, almost mocking, and for a terrible moment, I thought it would charge straight for my door. But then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it slunk back into the shadows, melting into the darkness with a grace that felt horribly wrong. As I sat in my darkened living room, every nerve in my body was on edge. My hands gripped the flashlight like a lifeline, the cold, smooth silver bullets in my pocket pressing against my leg with every shallow breath I took. Outside, the shadows seemed to stretch and shift, pooling around the edges of my house, hiding something. Then I saw a movement on the street outside. Sheriff Nolan was walking slowly, his flashlight sweeping across the dimly lit road. Relief flooded me for a second. He'd come to check on me, to keep me safe. I rushed to the window, hands raised to signal him. But then, in the dim light, I saw it. Something massive, low to the ground, slinking just beyond his line of sight. Its hulking shape blended with the darkness, but the pale glint of its eyes was unmistakable. The werewolf. It was barely 10 feet behind him, every muscle coiled, ready to strike. "Sheriff!" He turned, his flashlight catching the creature's face for an instant. It snarled, a twisted, horrible sound, its lips curling back over rows of sharp, jagged teeth. Sheriff Nolan's hand flew to his belt, his fingers fumbling with the silver bullets. He managed to load his gun and fired once, twice, each shot ringing out in the still night air. But the creature was too fast. Both shots missed, whistling past its massive shoulders as it lunged forward with terrifying speed. I watched in horror as the sheriff staggered back, eyes wide with shock, but it was already upon him. The werewolf slammed into him with a force that threw him to the ground, its claws sinking into his shoulders. I didn't wait to see what came next. I crouched down beneath the window, pressing my back against the wall, breathing hard and shallow, as if somehow the darkness could shield me from what was happening outside. My hands were shaking so hard that the flashlight rattled against the floor. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block it out, but I could still hear it. The awful snarling, the sheriff's strangled yells, the muffled thuds of a body hitting the ground. The sounds seeped into the silence, filling every inch of my mind with a horror so consuming, so absolute, that I could barely breathe. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the sound stopped. An oppressive silence settled over the house, heavy and dark, pressing down on me from all sides. I sat there, crouched under the window, my heart thundering as I waited for any sign that it had left, or worse, that it had noticed me. I hugged my knees to my chest, trying to ground myself, but it was useless. The fear had rooted itself deep within me, creeping through my veins, whispering that it would find me next, that it was only a matter of time. I felt like a trapped animal, cornered in my own home, and somehow I knew that whatever was out there, it was still watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The hours crept by with agonizing slowness, each minute stretching longer than the last. My heart hadn't stopped pounding since I ducked beneath the window, and the silence felt like a living thing, pressing in on me from every direction. I hugged my knees tighter to my chest, my fingers digging into my arms, as if holding myself together was the only way to keep from breaking apart. Outside, the world was cloaked in darkness, thick and unyielding. I imagined it lurking somewhere in that darkness, watching the house, waiting for me to make a sound or a wrong move. The walls around me felt thin, useless against the relentless terror pressing down on me. Every creak of the old wood, every whisper of wind against the window felt like a claw reaching toward me. I could almost hear it, the soft scrape of nails on the wood outside, the low, hungry growl echoing in the silence. The fear had taken root so deeply within me that it was almost physical, a cold, tight sensation creeping through my veins. I couldn't shake the feeling that it knew I was here, that it could sense my fear, my desperation. It would find me. It was only a matter of time. But then, I saw the first, faint glimmer of dawn. At first, it was just a thin, gray line along the horizon, barely visible through the trees outside. I forced myself to watch as that line grew brighter, stretching upward, washing the darkness with a soft, muted light. My heart lifted slightly, my breaths coming a little easier. The monster's hold over me loosened, little by little, as the gray turned to pale blue and then to a soft, comforting pink. The night seemed to peel away with the dawn, taking its secrets and its horrors with it. The shadows began to retreat, shrinking back into the places they belonged, the thick weight of the night lifting slowly from my mind. I could feel my muscles begin to relax, the knots of tension loosening as the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees, spilling golden light across the room. I stayed there, crouched beneath the window, watching as the world transformed around me. The creeping fear, so overwhelming only moments ago, began to feel like a distant memory, something unreal and faded under the soft warmth of the morning light. My heart slowed, each beat steady and grounding as I felt the comfort of daybreak wash over me. The safety of daylight was more than just an illusion. It was a shield, a barrier that I knew the creature couldn't cross. Whatever had lurked outside through the night had lost its power, retreating to its hiding place, bound by the light of the rising sun. The whispers of fear in my mind faded into silence, and for the first time in hours, I felt like I could breathe again. I unfolded myself slowly, feeling the ache in my legs and arms from being huddled in that position all night. My movements felt stiff and foreign, as if I were waking from a long, twisted dream. I stood, stretching, and glanced out the window. The street was empty, quiet in that early morning way that felt so far removed from the horrors of the night. I wanted to believe it was over, that with the dawn the danger had passed. But even as I looked at the peaceful scene outside, a lingering sense of unease remained. The house was filled with soft morning light, gentle and warm, but I knew that when night fell again, so too would the shadows. The thought haunted me as I moved through the house, checking each lock and window, reinforcing every barrier between me and the outside. I knew I'd never forget what it felt like to be trapped in the dark, waiting, listening, fearing the thing just beyond my door. Daylight may have saved me this time, but the night was patient, and somehow I knew it would return. As the days passed, fear settled over our town like a heavy fog, clinging to every building, every street. People spoke in whispers, as if afraid their voices might carry into the woods. No one dared to stay out after sunset anymore. Instead, they rushed to their homes as dusk began to creep in, locking themselves inside long before night fully fell. The events of that terrible night spread like wildfire, the story twisting and growing in each retelling. And even those who hadn't seen it could feel its truth, that there was something lurking just beyond the edge of our sight, waiting for darkness to fall. The sheriff's absence left a mark, a hollow space in the town that no one could fill. His home remained empty, a ghostly reminder of the price of defiance. People stopped asking questions, stopped making plans. The last few who tried to organize a search had come back wide-eyed and silent, unwilling to speak of whatever they'd seen. It was as if a curse had settled over the place, something unspoken and unsolvable, something that bound the town in a grip of unrelenting terror. Eventually, our little town turned into a fortress by nightfall. Doors were double-locked, windows barricaded with iron bars, silver charms and crucifixes hanging from every threshold. We fortified our homes with anything we could find, some desperate attempt to hold the darkness at bay. The streets were empty after dark, the silence deep and unnatural, broken only by the occasional, distant howl drifting from the woods. Even inside our homes, we felt vulnerable, the walls seeming too thin, too frail to keep the creature out. The sense of safety we'd once known was gone. The night had become an enemy, something to be feared, respected, and survived. People began leaving, those who could afford to. Families packed up and moved away under the bright light of day, unwilling to risk another night. But most of us had no choice but to stay, trapped in this uneasy existence, our lives revolving around the setting sun, around the constant, pressing need to keep the creature out. We lived in dread, clinging to each day's fleeting hours of light, knowing that with each sunset, we would be plunged back into that endless cycle of fear. Every night, the darkness would gather, thick and suffocating, wrapping itself around us, closing in, as if the entire town was caught in its grasp. And even as the barricades grew stronger and the houses became more fortified, we knew, deep down, that it wasn't enough. The creature was still out there, lurking, patient, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Hope faded, bit by bit, each night eroding it further until it was nothing more than a memory. We no longer believed that the creature could be stopped. We just held on, enduring each night like it was a siege, knowing that eventually it would find its way in.